As a cultural institution, the university is an old and venerable one. A 2001 book called The Uses of the University said that of the institutions in the West that have endured in recognisable form since the 1520s, 70 out of 85 were universities. But education, of course, is also a modern industry, increasingly shaped and driven by economic rather than academic imperatives and constantly challenged by changes in technology. In Australia, of course, it's an international industry, and the international market was huge until COVID-19 brought Australia's international education industry to a shockingly abrupt standstill. So on the Roundtable today, we're discussing what the post-COVID future of the university might be, with three people who are already engaging deeply with these questions. Michael D. Smith is Professor of Information Technology and Marketing at Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh, and he's the author of an article in The Atlantic which asks the question, are universities going the way of CDs and cable TV? Welcome to the Roundtable, Michael.
Pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
It's a pleasure. You're joined also by John Fischetti, Professor and Interim Pro-Vice-Chancellor of the Faculty of Education and the Arts at the University of Newcastle. John wrote an article on the Conversation website called 3 Things Universities Must Do to Survive Disruption. Welcome, John.
Good morning.
And joining us on the Roundtable also is Tamsin Peach, Associate Professor, Social and Political Sciences Program at the University of Technology, Sydney. And Tamsin is also the host of the podcast, The New Social Contract, which looks at the relationship between universities, the state and the public and how it might be reshaped by the pandemic. Welcome to you also, Tamsin.
Hello, good morning.
Great to have all three of you here. And Michael, if I could start with you and your article in The Atlantic. You say perhaps somewhat chillingly for people engaged in the university sector, our model is under threat. And as we've seen in other industries, technology will change how we work and that process will hurt. Can you give us an outline of your perspective about, how technology is challenging the traditional model of the university?
So a lot of this came from research that I've done on the entertainment industry and how technology affected the entertainment industry. My colleague and I wrote a book that was inspired in part by the fact that the entertainment industry was absolutely convinced that technology would have no effect on how it did business because it had been stable for the last century.
Famous last words, yeah.
Right. And as I talked about that to my students, I realized that the university today, at least in my view, looks a lot like the entertainment industry did about 10 years ago.
And by that, do you mean partially in denial as well?
I think we're very much in denial. I think we believe that we are going to be the one information-based industry that is unchanged by information technology, even as we watch all sorts of other industries around us get radically changed. And
do you see this as a sort of existential threat to the university or something that merely is the latest adaptation?
Well, that's what I was trying to get at in the article. I think it's a significant threat to the way we do our business, but I think it actually could be a great enabling force for our core mission of educating students and preparing them to contribute to society.
Thanks very much, Michael. Okay, let's move to John Fischetti now. John, Australia's got a population of about 25 million people. How many universities do we have, and what does that say about the structure of our education industry?
Yeah, we've got about 40 full-fledged universities, and if you did the math, that's probably a few too many.
Right. Okay. I don't know if you've got a hit list, but what do you think that says about the nature of the education sector at the moment, and how is that going to be changed by COVID-19?
Well, I think if you remember the Kevin Costner movie Field of Dreams back from 20 years ago or so, the motto was build it and they'll come. I think that's been our philosophy, and it's probably led us to 3 overs that we might have to reconsider. The first one is an over-reliance on full-fee paying international students to make up for empty seats when the domestic market runs a little flat, which it's doing now in the demand-driven system. The second would be an over sort of a capitalization or indebtedness on building physical buildings in a time when the online world is increasing. And then an overuse of big box lecture halls to do rather cheap teaching very kind of efficiently, but maybe not well, to pay for some of the rest of the stuff up the food chain. Those three overs are all in threat, and they were in threat before COVID. They've just been exaggerated because of it.
Interesting to hear you describe the lecture halls as big box. Well, I suppose it rings true from my experience of university some ages ago. I'm going to come to Tamsin Peach in just a second, but just before I do, just wanted to ask Michael Smith, those three overs that John's described in the Australian context, from the perspective of America, do they resonate?
Oh, very, very much so. I was smiling on each point. The one that I find most interesting is the big box lecture halls. And again, the analogy I think about is lecture halls are kind of like the broadcast channel for television, in the sense that when I'm in a lecture hall, I'm trying to make the middle 80% of the audience happy, even though I know 10% are probably bored and 10% are probably completely lost. I have no time for them because of the nature of the channel. Could we create a channel where we bring in those edges and allow them to take more time on topics or move along from topics they already know?
Really fascinating question. I'd like to come back to that in our discussion, but first I'd like to go to Tamsin Peach. And Tamsin, you have been hosting the podcast, The New Social Contract, looking at exactly these issues. What themes would you say have been emerging from the discussions you've been having on the new social contract?
I've been trying to talk to people about how the relationship between universities sits in the context of a relationship with government and the state and various publics on the other hand, so society, and what society wants of universities, what government tries to get universities to do, and then what universities' missions are. And people have been going in various directions. We've had some really interesting focus around climate and how the imperatives of the climate challenge on top of COVID might set some goals for what the mission of the university needs to be as we look forward to the 21st century. And then thinking too about how embedding universities in their communities is going to perhaps change what some of their functions might be.
I'd like to ask all of you about the sort of the model of on-site education. How important is the campus attendance model of tertiary education, do you think, in terms of quality of educational experience, but then also current university business models? If I could start with you, Michael Smith.
Well, it's hugely important in terms of our business model. And that's our key selling point right now. What I find interesting, and I'll get in trouble with, I'm sure, many of my colleagues for saying this, but at least in the US, for the past 10 years, we've said that the online experience is inherently inferior to what you can get on campus. But this semester, when we went online, we charged our students exactly the same price for that experience. We can't have it both ways. Either it's every bit as good and worth every bit as much, or it's inherently inferior and we owe a lot of people a refund.
John Fischetti, what's your perspective on that? That question of what the campus attendance model does in terms of quality of education, but also the business model.
I think it comes down to what we think we're preparing people to do with their education. If it's purely a vocational or training mode rather than a building of the human mind mode, then the versatility of doing things online or face-to-face are fairly interchangeable. But in Australia's last 50 years, we've kind of punched above our weight because we've been able to use the resources out of the mining industry and the related industries to kind of have extra set of wealth that's led a lot of us to have middle-class lives we wouldn't have. But the mine is now going to be the mind. And over the next few years, as the declining revenues from just drilling Mother Earth and shipping it around the world decline, and we have to go inside our own brain cells to innovate, everything that can be will be automated if it hasn't already. And the kind of skills we need from Australian citizens is really related to building the human experience. And that involves a critical thinking, collaboration, the things that allow people to be supportive of one another in intellectual imagination. the notion of strong communication skills, those things can be done online and certainly effectively, but the human experience is what people want, and that still takes place, at least in part, when you're with other people in a common area. But it has to be engaging, it has to be profound, it has to be worth driving to a car park, finding one of those spots and going inside and engaging. So universities are, in many respects, but will have to evolve to really being inspiring places that prepare you for life, not just for the job. And that component, I think, is actually increased, not decreased in importance.
I'll come to you in a second, Tamsin Peach, on that question. But we have had a text from Alex, who's a curriculum designer specialising in online learning. And Alex says that they've sort of observed during COVID-19, what's described as a complete shift in attitude amongst university staff, from resistance to welcoming and seeking advice and assistance in terms of the shift to online. Does that resonate with you, Tamsin? And can I get your thoughts on that broader question of how central campus activity is?
Yeah, I think staff have probably engaged with online learning in a new way, but I think they're also finding that students, whilst liking some aspects of it, are also longing for some of the in situ aspects that John was talking about. And I have to say, I completely agree. We're not like brains on sticks. So sometimes there's a tendency to separate the content of learning from the context of it. And, one of the functions of universities across the 20th century, and I can only see it as more important going into the 21st century, has been to constitute the public, to bring us together across all our differences. And that is a kind of function that happens, in that big box lecture theatre. And I think I probably have to agree that we'll be seeing a lot more blended context in terms of the way learning is delivered. But one of the jobs that the big box lecture theatre did was it brought people together in a space, and in that it was a sort of a metaphor for what the nation was. It literally made the nation in the room, and that's why access to education is such a big issue. So I'm not sort of suggesting that we're not going to see more online learning, but I think we do need to keep at the centre of our vision of the university that function of constituting the public, the place and the community we all live in together.
Michael Smith, in terms of the function of constituting the public, would it be right to think that there are far more competitors to the university's role in that now than there have ever been? And what are your thoughts on how universities can constitute the public, as Tamsin says?
Well, I agree with everything Tamsin said about the importance of the in situ experience. My only concern is, if the market for that shifts to online, we can say that, in class is better than online. But if people aren't willing to pay for in class prices, given what they can find online, our arguments aren't going to carry a lot of weight with the market. So I agree 100%. I'm just worried that we're going to see people shift to saying, you know what, I can get what I can get online is good enough. And to your point about competition, there's a whole lot more competition online. That the ability to enter this space is going to raise a lot of competition from a lot of players we just never had to worry about.
Yeah, well, let's talk a little bit about that competition, because on the Roundtable we're discussing the future of universities with Michael D. Smith, Professor of Information Technology and Marketing at Carnegie Mellon University, John Fischetti, Interim Pro-Vice Chancellor of the Faculty of Education and the Arts at the University of Newcastle, and the host of the podcast, The New Social Contract, Associate Professor Tamsin Peach of UTS in Sydney. John Fischetti, we heard Michael refer to the increasing competition online, which leads me to the question, what are MOOCs and what's your assessment of their current place in the sort of education ecosystem?
Well, that's a great follow-up, because I think one of the things that's also being challenged is the notion that learning takes place inside of what we call semesters, which might be 12, 13, 14-week experiences, and you do several of those and we'll call it a degree, and you add all those together and you could get yourself to a master's and do the same thing toward a PhD. Massive online courses, or MOOCs, or short courses or modularized approaches, or what most people do that are listening in their own workplace. They do continuing professional learning, but they do it in chunks. It might be a day, they might be half days, they could be a series of smaller learning events, are the increasing trend. And we've thought of learning in these chunks of semesters, but actually a lot of what we've done can be condensed or compressed or intensified. And that aspect is what's increasing in the marketplace. And then you can piece those little packages together into what we may currently call a course or into a program. And the advantage of that allows people to get learning on demand and when they need it, rather than when we decide it's in the second semester of your second year, which you may not actually need that skill until into your fourth year or into your work setting. So it allows us to give education to people in real time.
And does that very much change the way that students engage with their learning? And do they get better outcomes, John?
The advantage, particularly for those that are not able to bite off an entire degree at one time, which is an increasing number of people around the world, they may be able to do some things for a little while or on a weekend or maybe over a 2 or 3 week period, not necessarily for a 3 or 4 year period at one time, allows them to pick up learning when it's right for them, when it's right for their employer, when it's right for their family, and to piece those together over a little bit of time to turn into something that still might be a certificate or a diploma or a degree. It also allows that content to be updated as opposed to go on and on with the old yellow notes theory that you teach the way you did before. The exciting component of that, it also allows you to borrow from other institutions. In University A, they may have the best program in accounting, and University B may have the best program in marketing, and you mix those together, and then you don't have to just go between, your own university, which may have certain limited strengths. The tricky part is articulating those across systems so everybody counts them. It's like having a currency that becomes the global currency, because otherwise, how does one University A account for that University B's learning? And there's lots of ways to do that, but many universities in Australia are pretty clunky at doing that right now.
Yeah, you can see the appeal of that in the abstract and perhaps for individual students. But yeah, I can imagine it poses all sorts of institutional challenges, financial not the least of them. But Tams and Peach, if I come back to you, I think you referred to this issue before about access to education, because we do have a sort of idealized concept of what experiences students can have at universities, but there is the perennial question of who that experience is available to. Is there evidence that moving to online genuinely can open up access to universities? Is that happening, or is it increasing the financial barriers to education?
Well, yeah, I mean, I guess it depends what you think university delivers. I think online learning does open up opportunities for people who are in work and perhaps earning money to access kind of content, learning content online. And maybe universities provide that. Maybe it's coming from other sort of providers. But I mean, a big part of what a university has been is also that on-campus situated experience. And part of that has had to do with the immense privilege of time at a particular stage in your life, which is also a rite of passage. It's not just about loading your brain up with content. It's about developing a set of relationships to other people, to each other, and most importantly, to civil society, through clubs and societies, through, the drinks you have in the pub after your lecture, through the sports you play. It's an immense privilege that embeds you in society, and it's that we've traditionally valued as much as what you pour into people's brains. And I think that is very much also a question of access. And to enable people to have that experience, we need to think about time as much as chunks of content.
Absolutely. Michael Smith, I'd be interested in your perspective on that question of access, particularly in America, where student debt is far more dramatic than in Australia, and whether or not, are MOOCs or other online forms of education actually reducing the barriers to access in America?
Oh, I think they are reducing the barriers to access. And the other thing I find interesting, particularly in the American system, is we we talk a lot about how we want to create opportunities for a lot of students, but then we measure our success based on selectivity. We measure our success based on how many students we reject. You know, that a school that rejects 9 out of 10 students is better than a school that accepts, or that only rejects 7 out of 10 students. That seems like an awfully strange metric to use as a measure of success, but it's forced on us by the limited amount of space we have in the classroom. Online, you can let everybody in, and I think when you do that, we're going to discover a lot of people who really thrive, who just didn't have the profile that would allow them to be admitted in the traditional process.
John Fischetti, you have written about the number of universities that Australia has, and we're obviously engaging in a time where we don't yet know how big the economic impacts of COVID-19 are going to be, but we know they're going to be very large. Do you envisage a situation where some institutions just simply aren't going to be able to survive? Is it going to be a case of the big old institutions being the ones that are most capable of dealing with the rough weather of COVID-19? What do you think?
Well, Australia has some really big name universities that sell their brand, and they've marketed that brand internationally really well. I think that notion of things is probably in jeopardy because it's been an over-reliance on selling that brand. I think what the customer wants now and what they will want in the future, both domestically and internationally, is really high value. And if they can get online just as good lectures from listening to the best lecturers in the world, they're really not going to pay top dollar for that anymore, face-to-face or online, because we could just find the best lecturers in the world and package those together in the short courses we were talking about. I think they're going to want the learning experience. And the good news is that we know that lifelong learning and the value of it is only increasing. With people's needing to be nimble and agile across the sectors, they'll be moving from different jobs and different careers through their whole lifetime. And that'll mean the need to pick up new skills, new knowledge, and to re-energize their brain through their entire lives. So the notion of large universities is not obsolete. The way we deliver things is evolving, but also the assumption that it has to happen when you're right as a school leaver or back for a concentrated time as a mature age student to regroup once is obsolete. We're going to be doing this more and more, and I think the versatility of universities to take the online tools but package the face-to-face in new ways, in intensive ways, in not necessarily thinking in 3 or 4 year degree ways, much more multiple products out there for people to get what they need when they need it to be able to get themselves equipped to have great lives. I think the other component is that some of what government tends to do, and these are governments all around the world that lean sort of conservative values, is they've moved their understanding of universities to be where we're going to get economic value. You even started this bit with the notion of that. The economic value is certainly relevant, but actually some of the things that universities provide are invaluable. The invaluable human characteristics that come from the learning process and learning with others, and particularly experts and mentors, applying that learning in a context of a face-to-face environment. So that's just a renewal of universities as we've always had. Your question is more about, do we need 40 of them? And the answer will be, there'll be consolidation and mergers, and it's probably going to be bumpy because we probably have a few too many. And it'll be planned by government, and it'll just happen the way the market sorts itself out. But the role of universities and the importance of them, I think, is actually increased, particularly if you add the research component that allows us to have not just teaching the old stuff, but actually using research to drive our teaching, is what Australia does as well as anywhere in the world.
Tamsin Peach, from the people you've spoken to on the new Social Contract podcast, are there particular institutions or other organisations that you think are really showing the way forward, dealing with these issues best at the moment?
In Australia? Well, I think there's a sort of different capacity of institutions to respond, and in some ways that's got to do with how much cash they've got in the bank and what they've done with the gold rush that has been international student revenue. And some universities that, the older institutions have been able to plough more of that revenue into buildings and into endowment in the case of the University of Melbourne, and some newer institutions have had to use it for ongoing operation. And we have to recognise that the reliance on international students' income has been a settlement that has basically been agreed upon by both sides of politics and universities that has enabled our universities to do so well over the last 15 years. But it's come to an end and it's unsustainable, and they knew that. They've known that for a while. Yeah. So yeah, I mean, I think the question is, what are the settings in which universities are going to have to operate? They have not known that there's been policy stasis for a good decade now. And having a framework will really help universities know how to navigate the changing context and what sorts of strategic decisions to make. And I think maybe one thing we are being pushed towards by this government is a fragmentation of the sector. And I really think that what we need is a big public discussion about what the job of universities are in serving society. And that's been missing. We can't just let the market make those decisions, because these are institutions that are here to serve societal goals. And, for the last 4 months, we've had a societal goal. We've had societal goals in the past, we've fought wars and reconstructed after economic crisis, and universities have actually been really central to that process. But at the moment, universities are receiving the smallest amount of government funding as a percentage of their revenue as they have at any point across the 20th century. So as we face that challenge of climate, it seems to me completely crucial that we have a big public conversation about what we want our universities to be in building the sustainable and just society that we're going to need if we're going to face rolling crises that come like bushfires and COVID.
Michael Smith, do you have a sense that public conversation is starting or being engaged with in the US or elsewhere?
Well, I was nodding in strong agreement. I love where this is ending with Tamsin's comments about us needing to come back to what's our purpose. That's one of the things I was trying to do in the Atlantic article. Is I think we in the university and society, we have to figure out what's the mission of the university. And once we figure that out, we're going to be able to respond to the technological change that we're facing. My fear is that we in the university aren't even sure what our mission is. And I believe that because I had my research assistant pull the mission statements of the top 25 U.S. universities.
Yes.
And they're an absolute mess. You read them and you get the impression that we have 7 to 9 missions serving 12 to 15 different consumer groups. We need to figure out what our mission is, and then we need to figure out how to use technology to fulfill that mission.
And we'll have to wrap up our roundtable discussion about the future of universities there. Thanks to all our guests today. Professor Michael D. Smith, who is from Carnegie Mellon University and who wrote the article in The Atlantic asking, are universities going the way of CDs and cable television? Also, Professor John Fischetti, Interim Pro-Vice-Chancellor of the Faculty of Education at the University of Newcastle and author of the Conversation article, 3 Things That Universities Must Do to Survive Disruption, as well as Associate Professor Tamsin Peach of the Social and Political Sciences program at the University of Technology, Sydney. And Tamsin hosts the podcast all about these issues called The New Social Contract.